Good afternoon, everyone. That was louder than I expected it to be. My name is Biddy Martin. I'm a president in residence in the School of Education here this year. And of what have I been president? Amherst College, most recently, and chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here. I'm really excited about this event. As you all probably know better even than I did until recently, the Askwith Forum is the School of Education's signature in-person event, and it's going to involve conversation with two extraordinary researchers and writers and thinkers, which I'll begin, and then you will have an opportunity to participate in. With that, I'm going to give the briefest of introductions. First, to Howard Gardner, who was, during my time as president of Amherst College, on the board of trustees of said college, and an extraordinary contributor, as you can imagine. He is, as you all probably all know, Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education, well known for his many books, and probably still best known for introducing us to multiple intelligences, which he certainly has. And Wendy Fischman, who is his partner, not only as co-author of this book, but in other pursuits, is a project director of, project director of Project Zero, co-author. And Howard has a few words for you before Wendy gives a brief presentation, and then we'll start the conversation. Welcome to all of you.
Thanks, Biddy. Good evening, everybody. It's good to be back in Longfellow Hall. I actually came here first in 1967 and have been a regular inhabitant of its halls ever since, at a place called Project Zero, which is on the second floor and the fourth floor, where it's been for various times over those 55 plus years. Wendy's a relative newcomer. She's only worked at Project Zero for 27 years. We've done a lot of research on a range of topics. But the first work he did was to really understand the nature of what it meant to be a good worker, or a good citizen. And we did that by speaking to adult professionals. But then we began to talk to students, high school students and college students, and we realized we didn't know nearly as much about how students thought about these issues as we should. So talking with Richard Light, who many of you know, is a professor with an expertise in higher education, we said, what books should we read to find out about college students? And in fact, if you look at the Chronicle of Higher Education, there are books that come out every week. But even though some of those books are very good, they're usually based on one school, one college or university, and all too often on one professor or administrator's view thereof. So we decided to do the opposite, and we undertook a very ambitious study. It took 10 years, 5 years of collecting data in many different schools, 2.5 years of analyzing the data, and then a long period of time writing it up in the book, which we're going to be talking about this evening. And the way we think about the book is that it's what we learned in our study, because we really believed that we didn't have any hypotheses. Now, you may think that's ridiculous, that people should say they have no hypotheses. But if you ask us what to expect when we began in 2012, we really had no notion of that. And as Wendy will explain, a number of things that we found out were a big surprise, and I think you'll be surprised, though perhaps not in the way that you think you're going to be surprised. With that tantalization, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy, and I guess I'll sit there until we have the conversation.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm just getting over laryngitis, so if I have to take a few sips, I'm not contagious. I've had it for almost a week, but if I have to take a few sips, forgive me. So I'm going to switch to the first slide here. I'm just going to give an overview for about 10 minutes, and then we look forward to having a conversation with Biddy. As Howard mentioned, we carried out 2,000 qualitative interviews across 8 different stakeholder groups, 1,000 students, first year and graduating, also 1,000 other adults, 500 faculty and administrators, and also 500 young alums, trustees, parents, and job recruiters. And these were carried out across 10 different institutions. You can see here the range of institutions which differed in terms of their geographic location, also in terms of selectivity, size, status. So some were private, some were public, others were residential, and others were commuter. I'm not going to talk about our research methodology, our data collection, or our data analysis, but please ask questions during the open question period if you have some. I'd be happy to answer them. You can also find me after this talk or on email. I love to talk about methodology. But now I'm going to focus on just a few findings that hopefully will structure our conversation. And also, as Howard mentioned, it is important to keep in mind that with Dick Light, we did structure the study to be exploratory, so we didn't know what we were going to find. We entered the study wanting just to have conversations with people and listening to them very carefully about what they said, but also what they didn't say. And as Howard said, many things did surprise us, both in terms of what people said and didn't say. And so the concepts and findings that we talk about today really emerged from their own. We didn't set out to test anything in particular. I'm not going to specifically talk about mental health and belonging, but those are 2 examples of concepts in 2012 that we didn't think would emerge as major problems in education. We hadn't actually heard the term belonging when we began our study. But when we began to analyze the data, we certainly saw traces of belonging and alienation. So just something to keep in mind. Our first finding is that students across disparate campuses are similar, even in the words they use. So in general, we find that students across all of our campuses talk very in similar ways about their goals, what they hope to achieve, what they hope to experience, also the challenges they confront, and their hopes for their college experience. And they do so because they wanted to change what they said at the beginning. That's a demonstration of higher education capital. It's what I used when I planned this presentation and preparing for this conversation. And it's what you're using to determine if what I'm saying is making sense to you, if it's familiar to what you've heard before, what you've read before, and maybe to your own experiences. We all use higher education capital naturally every day. So back to the correlation here that's significant. As you can see, we find that students who have high head cap scores, scores of 3, are more likely to be transformational about the college experience, and students who have low head cap scores, scores of 1, are less likely to be transformational about the college experience. Put in another way, if you are transactional about your college experience, you're more likely to be low in head cap than to have high head cap. At least that's what our 1,000 students demonstrated to us. And this is important because it shows that mental models matter. We're often asked why we might be against college being focused on the job. We're not against jobs. We're both parents and hope that our kids and grandkids will have jobs. But it does show that if you're only focused on the job, if you only see college as a transactional experience, you do miss the learning of college. So the last finding I wanted to point out is about mission sprawl. There are lots of goals across the sector, too many for any single individual or institution to achieve. You can see here the key words of the mission statements of the 10 different schools that were involved in our study. And while these are all laudable goals, things like citizenship, leadership, diversity, it's too much for any one person. And when a school does try to do too much, students become overwhelmed and misguided. And also, they begin to forget about the intellectual piece. Here you can see intellectual. Intellectual is just one word in a sea of words, and it's not even the one that's most bold. So in a sense, higher education gets lost here. Our primary recommendation is that higher education and the institutions in it need to hone and sculpt their individual missions, focus that on learning and higher education capital. It's what makes them special in our country and unique in our country. And they need to carefully onboard students to that mission from day one and continue that onboarding and reminding them of that intellectual mission throughout their college experience. And if there is another mission, like the arts or religion, for example, those missions need to be carefully intertwined so that students understand they're not just extras or items on a checklist that they need to achieve, yet another thing to achieve. And they need to see how it is connected to learning. So in brief, we need students who understand the purpose of college. We need faculty and administrators who embody the mission of college focused on learning, and we need institutions to reflect this mission both inside and out. So thank you. We look forward to talking with Biddy. I can go right here. It's okay.
Is this yours? Where am I comfortable?
Would you rather be in the middle or?
Anywhere. You sit where you were sitting. Jody probably had something in mind for us, but I don't know that we know what it is. It's good, we're fine. Well, thank you both. So I think I'll start sort of globally and ask, first, talk a little bit more about your recommendations. And then what I'd like to know is how realistic you think they are.
Do you want to start?
Yeah.
You want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, this is the way we work often. So as I said, our primary recommendations do focus on carefully sculpting and honing missions, but also onboarding students to that mission. So often we find that when we go to campuses, and we went on all 10 campus tours and interviews, we find that the messages that campuses are giving actually don't reflect the mission of learning and what we would consider to be higher education capital. It's very focused on buildings, programs, centers, which are enticing, but at the same and inviting to parents and to students, but at the same time really distracts from the primary mission of higher education. And so while it seems simple to get people to agree on what a primary mission is, it really is the crux of what we should be focused on. And in many ways, the buildings and the programs and the centers are causing what we call projectitis, this plethora of programs from which students really pick and choose and forget about this emphasis on learning. So in the book, we talk specifically about different programs that we visited and investigated, but I would say overall, those are our recommendations.
Yeah, I'd make two other points. One is that most American higher institutions were religious till the 20th century, and they basically shed religion, and I probably wasn't bothered by that. But as a result, except for the job issue, most people don't know why they're in college. And if you could give them something which would be a job, they just as soon skip it. We're now working much more with religious institutions because we want to understand the extent to knowing why you're there, which doesn't mean you have to be a good Jew or Catholic, but that you're, let's say, it's spiritual or it's helping the community, that kind of thing. So the students actually know, and it's, as Wendy says, it's reverberated in their classes and what the teachers do. Then, I mean, I've been at Harvard forever, and people don't agree why Harvard's here. It's a big and important school, but you wouldn't get any kind of agreement about what it is that's most important here, except maybe success.
Really? You think that's right?
Let me make my second point.
Okay, sure.
Before I forget it, right? People in the United States, and that's me as well as all of you, are incredibly ignorant about how education has been done in different other countries and at different periods and so on. I mean, if you say here, get rid of sports, you'd get shot. Unfortunately, you might literally get shot, but sports don't exist as anything except a fun thing in most countries. The belief in the specialness of the residential thing, again, it's very, very American. Having all sorts of undergraduate, all sorts of degree and professional and non-professional options wrapped into schools. Again, that's very American. And Wendy and I are actually now editing with Bill Kirby a journal on lessons we can learn from other countries. Mm-hmm. So I think that's. So when you say, you were asking whether it was reasonable?
No, I said realistic. Those are two different things.
I think it's where you have to start.
Yeah.
We're working with some schools, we won't mention them, which we think do take, liberal arts and big questions about who you are very, 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 very seriously. And let's just use higher ed cap because we've introduced it. If those schools could demonstrate that at the end of the day, their students can really attend and analyze and reflect and connect and communicate, they would have something to show off. We didn't use the liberal arts measure because that would require knowing what the students, what they would majored in and so on.
Right, right.
But yeah, no, I would certainly, if I had children or grandchildren now, and I was looking at schools, I would like schools which knew why they were there rather than they were trying to please every possible customer.
But you actually make the point that administrators and faculty know why they're there. So it's not that the schools don't know why they're there, but you find that students don't reflect that particular view when you ask them, why go to college or what are you experiencing? That's interesting to me. The reason I ask whether it's realistic is because I really like the emphasis you put on intertwining and the importance of intertwining what you would see as additional missions, but which I see to some degree as just central to the core mission. I like your emphasis on the possibility and desirability of intertwining things. Even Howard athletics can be a part of intertwining physical, intellectual, and mental health done well. I'm not going to argue that it's in good shape, athletics at major universities here in this country.
Well,
but
actually,
certainly diversity, take diversity, for example, which gets listed on the word cloud as if it's a separate item. But over time, what's meant by diversity or equity is increasingly folded into the intellectual work in the classroom, the work of faculty, and to the extent that that happens, it seems to me that it is consistent with what you're arguing. So I guess what I'm wondering is whether taking intertwining very seriously, you might give a little bit when you say at one point in the book, you should have one, in addition to head cap of the intellectual sort, you should have one additional mission at most. That's the part I don't think is realistic, but I do think you're right to say if those additional priorities are not intertwined with the kind of intellectual growth that you're looking for, they won't realize the potential in them either. Does that seem?
I think it's an interesting point.
Okay.
And what I would say is it's really an empirical issue.
Yeah.
I mean, let's say we're going to go X college, and they will agree that higher ed capital is important, but they have a half a dozen other missions. Will that help, or will that confuse? That's why the schools that are religious or military, let's just use those two examples, I think have much less difficulty intertwining, because you kind of know, sort of what the major theme is and then what the other theme is. But it's an empirical question. It might be possible, particularly at a large state school, that you could have several sub-themes. What do you think?
Well, your question about realistic, I think part of the problem is that higher education is left to deal with the problem that K through 12 in many ways has created.
Yeah.
So the messages that are given to students at young ages, whether that's from family or from early educational experiences, the focus is on getting into college and not really preparing students for what the college experience is. And athletics is a perfect example of that. That's, for most students, at least in my experience, unless they're going to become professional athletes, it's a way to get into college, and often at very young ages, like 8th grade students are committing to schools. There's no reason why that should be such a separate endeavor for students. But today in our society, students really do see that as separate. If you're an athlete, that's how you identify and define yourself, and really see college as a way just to get the degree in order to pursue the sport. So
but that's a small portion of the population, I would say. But I brought up athletics. That's my fault, because I knew that it would provoke. Let's go back to some things that
But the messages are important that students are getting at young ages, and that's hard.
Yeah.
That's a systemic problem. So in terms of when you ask if it's realistic, I think it needs to happen. It needs to be addressed systemically and not just by higher education.
I totally agree, Wendy. And actually, one question I was going to ask has to do with methodology to some degree. And that is, you end up sort of locating the solution to the problem you've demonstrated. You lay that at the feet of higher education and higher education leadership and faculty. But many of the problems you've identified, including students tending to use the same not very vivid language across many different institutions to talk about why they're in college, those are problems that are created by the direction in which the society as a whole has gone. And for that reason, the solution, I don't think, and I frequently say this to students, or I did when I was speaking with our students, the problems that are society-wide can be addressed and to some extent perhaps ameliorated within colleges and universities. But if they're not addressed at a different level, we can't solve them. That is, the college cannot make good on everything that that afflicts us more broadly as a society. I'm guessing the reason your solutions are so higher ed focused is because methodologically you would say that's the domain for which you have evidence and also ideas. But I do see it as, it does mean, I think at times, that the problems with higher ed loom larger than I would attribute to higher ed alone. And therefore the question is, can the solutions really work?
Well, if we think about fixing higher ed, it seems easier than the 14,000 school districts that we're dealing with. I mean, I think of it a bit as a chess game, and we haven't talked about this, but in the journal that we're editing about higher education abroad, there's the description of two schools, Minerva, who some people will have heard of, and the London Interdisciplinary School, which very few people have heard of. And these are places which are really placing a bet on a certain highly intellectual view of what higher education is. We all know, if we gossip about the University of Austin, which put itself forth that way, but doesn't seem to really be doing that. But, one can look historically at times in any sector when school did something, and then another school began to do it, and then it becomes, if not the norm, at least a very, so certainly if you said to me, would it be easier to fix in my lifetime, or let's say the lifetime of people here, the K-12 sector or the higher ed sector, I would clearly think the higher ed sector would be easier.
Yeah, that's probably right.
What do you think? Wendy's put 4 kids through the...
Yeah. I think it just needs to be a conversation across society. I think that's why at the end of the book, we speak to all constituencies in the higher education sector, but also to parents. And to K through 12 educators and to students themselves.
Yeah.
I think it's a problem that everybody needs to deal with. Higher education can't do it alone.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Let me ask you about head cap. I've started using that now as a term. I, as a humanist, appreciate your definition of what head cap might be, but what results do you think you might have gotten if you, instead of asking them a series of open-ended questions and then looked at the language they used to respond, what if you'd asked them to solve, to deal with a problem set, or had asked them to solve an equation, or to talk about the possible impact of CRISPR and gene editing? I mean, I guess especially the ones ready to graduate, not necessarily the entering students. But don't those skills, those intellectual skills, also count as head cap? And given the rate at which colleges and universities are cutting back on the humanities, which is a real shame and disgrace, in my opinion, I wonder if the definition of head cap, despite that disgrace, needs to be a little broader, because the use of language in the age of social media, the fact that so many students use the same words and repeat themselves in sort of abbreviated form, strikes me as a symptom of additional problems too.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And actually in the current work we're doing now with colleges that are interested in us unpacking or discovering head cap across students without doing interviews, we're interested in trying some of that out. So maybe I'll contact you about possible puzzles that we could have students think about. But I think my response is the reason why we didn't do that is because we came up with the concept, really, as I said, it emerged. So we didn't go into the study looking for higher education capital. It emerged because as we met weekly in our research team meetings, we wanted a way to describe how students were different from one another in a qualitative way, not just by any demographics that we may be able to see or potentially collect, which we didn't do systematically, but also we had some really great conversations with students where we got into lots of substantive issues with them, and we had these experiences with students that were able to, that sort of got it and understood why they were in college and were able to talk about it so clearly. And then we had conversations that might be over in 20 minutes because students had very few answers. And we wanted a way to talk about those differences. And so it wasn't necessarily set out to be a measure of who had higher education capital and who didn't, but to describe how students could actually sustain a conversation and talk about what mattered to them.
I mean, I like that, of course. I think that's important. It's crucial. I just had the question in my head about what higher ed capital could be defined as being. I also wondered, since you saw what an issue mental health has become on college campuses, and not only there, and since you're really interested in a sort of more holistic picture of how students learn. When you were interviewing and there were students who said very little or whose interviews were over in 20 minutes, I know this wouldn't have been part of the method, but did you think about different kinds of personality? So did you wonder, was this student just particularly introverted? Or there was an example of a student named Rebecca in your study. And before I read much detail about Rebecca and what emerged later about her relationship with the professor, I thought to myself, that first response she gave you all was kind of surly. So is this more about her just refusing to answer in the way that she thinks you want her to? Or is she really lacking head cap? Okay, do you mind if I ask questions like this? I mean, this is just the way my brain works, you know?
No, this is fun.
You get a high head cap.
I have high head cap. Yeah, ask me to solve a math problem.
Okay, well, I'll start, and Howard, you can chime in. So, in general, the people that we interviewed, they all volunteered and signed up. We compensated them.
Yeah.
So for the most part, I would say that our data is skewed to people who wanted to talk to us.
Yeah.
If they really didn't want to talk to us, they didn't participate unless they desperately needed money. And every once in a while, I'm sure we got those participants, especially during the holiday time. We saw lots of signups. We also had cookies at our sign-up table, which also helped. I would say the opposite was true. I think in many ways, students and also faculty and administrators that we interviewed, and sometimes trustees, actually saw this as a therapy session and got a lot out on the table because they, especially students, didn't feel like they had other adults to talk to about the college experience.
Yeah.
And so we heard a lot about probably too much about their own personal issues, their angst, their challenges, also their anxieties, which was, this big finding beginning in 2012, before the 2016 presidential election and before COVID, where we heard about mental health issues. And specifically to mental health, by and large, we did not hear about the medical mental health problems that might need to be treated with medication, for example, or like suicidal attempts or bipolar disorders. We heard much more about the angst to perform successfully. This is what Howard spoke about at the beginning, and this is across the range of colleges, that they felt the need to develop a perfect profile and to get A's in order to be successful or to accomplish what they want to in college. Again, it was about earning and not learning, and this is what caused the sleepless nights. That was actually a question. We asked students, what keeps you up at night? And it was the angst about doing well.
A couple of things that your question prompt. One, except for Olin College of Engineering, which we deliberately chose as a control school, all these schools claim to be liberal arts. So they, if they were just doing tech, they wouldn't have been in our sample. And very surprisingly, I don't think there was any variable, but tell me if I'm wrong, Wendy, where when we compared science, social science, and humanities students, there was any different.
No.
And that's interesting.
That is
because,
interesting,
you might have said, well, the science students are better, so they'll have higher head cap, or they don't like to write and talk, so they lower, but it was remarkably similar. And the interview was quite wide-ranging, with 40-some questions, and, we often intertwined things that were interesting to us. But we asked questions like, if there's a problem on campus, is there someone or someplace you would go? We said to them, there was a question where there were two rank order questions, and one of them said, what's the purpose of college? There were 4 choices. Wendy could tell you what they were. And when somebody said to get a job, we then asked, and what happens if the job disappears in 3 years? We never got a cogent answer. That's frightening. And of course, that's before ChatGPT.
Yeah, because that's the right question.
And one that I think you have to look at the book because it's too much. We asked students if you could give one book to a graduating student, what book would it read? What book would they read? And that was quite fascinating.
Okay,
We'll
can we
leave that
talk
for
about that? No, let's talk about that. Talk more about the results.
Well, I try not as a researcher to say things are disappointing, but this was a disappointing finding. Dr. Seuss, Oh, the Places You Should Go, was very popular, as was most reads that you might assign typical students in high school. So very few books that were named in the top 10 were books that you would expect a student to read in college. That was the first major sort of disappointing finding. A lot of individuals, including adults, talked about self-help books or personal development books. And also we conducted lots of interviews where students, and sometimes even other adults, but especially students, would tell us that they never read.
Yeah.
So then we actually changed the question and said, well, could you tell us about a movie or a TV show or series that you might want to recommend to a graduating senior? And really all we were trying to ask was, what are the messages that you would want to convey to a fellow graduating senior about college?
Yeah.
What would you want to share with them? And the book question became overwhelming to people because they had to admit that they didn't read.
Yeah, that is part of what I was wondering when I read what you all had to say about that. But could I say one thing? And that is, first of all, I have a question and a comment. The question is, why did you choose to formulate it in that way? What book would you give a graduating senior, as opposed to asking what book has had the biggest impact on you? Because then I started thinking, okay, if somebody asks me what I would give someone that I'm thinking about, then I'm thinking about that person and what they might need, as opposed to what book I think is actually fabulous. The other thing I wanted to say is the books that the names of books you got, The Great Gatsby,
To Kill a Mockingbird.
To Kill a Mockingbird. There were 2 or 3 others.
How to Win Friends and Influence People, which I thought
that really shocked me.
Out of print.
I know how they get access to that. But in any case, the thing that amazed me was I went to a not very good public high school, and I would not have read those books in high school. So when you all said these are high school books, I had to say to myself, of course that's a long time ago because I'm old, but I'm guessing there's still students who come even to Harvard who didn't read some of the books that you all characterized as high school books in high school.
But this is a wonderful segue to what I wanted to say. Lest you think, you in the audience, that Wendy and I are gloomy Gusses. We did a study of many interesting programs at different campuses around the country, and one of them, as you know very well, was at Amherst, and was a course given by the late Jeff Ferguson on how to read a book and how to write a paper, and it was designed particularly for people who went to what Harvard used to call in my day, believe it or not, remote and apparently inferior schools.
Yes, apparently.
Giving kids the tools so they could do that kind of thing.
Yes.
And we call these the ALPS, and we have how many do we have in the book? We must have at least a dozen programs, which on the spirit of, well, you guys are giving a gloomy picture. What are some things one could do? And I think those courses that would develop at Amherst about writing a paper and reading a book are ones that are particularly good for kids who didn't go to Andover or to Newton High School.
But actually, I think that program was designed for students who were maybe first-generation students or other, but then it expanded to all students because it was faculty felt all students could use this.
Absolutely. Well, it was what we don't teach very much anymore. It was, Jeff's course was like what at one point would have been called rhetoric. It was a course, it was giving them a course in rhetoric as they learned what they needed to learn in his African American Studies course. So,
but your question is a good one about why we framed that book question the way we did.
Yeah.
If I could do it over again, I would carefully reword that question, because
Yeah.
I think the supposition that you're giving somebody something, I think, created more of the Dr. Seuss, oh, you'll go places, because
That's what
a
I was
typical
wondering,
sort
yeah.
of graduation gift. But we really wanted to know what individuals wanted to convey to others, not just what was impactful for themselves.
Indeed, this suggests a question which I would not have thought of. If you had one thing from your college experience that you could give to somebody else, what would it be? It wouldn't make much sense for freshmen, but for seniors it would be. And I guess we could look at some of the alums' responses.
Yeah.
We did ask every individual, including the faculty and administrators, what the most transformative educational experience they had to date was. And actually, for a lot of the college students, we find that the experiences they talk about are off campus, internships, and study abroad.
Study abroad.
Rather than the experiences on campus. And so while those in student life who plan those trips might be very happy, if you think about how much money we pour into some of the resources on campus, students barely recognize that they exist.
I don't think your book is gloomy. I mean, I really enjoyed it. You know, I've got notes throughout, and I think that, you know, what you found is in some ways surprising, also not surprising, and that your recommendations are really important. I think imagining that colleges and universities will go to one and maybe two sets of priorities for college is somewhat, whether it's realistic or not is not the issue so much as whether it would be a good thing. I mean, I would say, even back in the 19th century, I'm only going that far back, for the history of Amherst, college was always about more than the intellectual substance, and even more than, for these religious schools, religion understood as the study of Greek and Latin, we might want to remind people. But it's always been more than that. And I think the integration of the mind with the body and the heart remain a requirement, really, for colleges and universities. How well those things are intertwined, as you say, or integrated into what's being learned is really crucial, and I think your point is absolutely spot on there. But I know that I need to ask you all to ask your questions now. Yes, I think we have someone going. There are mics on both aisles, I see. Yes, go ahead. You were first, I think.
Professor Gardner, I kind of a question about, if you think about the modern day education available at Oxford or Cambridge, it's very subject focused. So as an undergrad, you might begin to study law, or you might begin to study psychology right away. It seems like in some of our top US colleges, we continue to focus on a liberal arts education, that even if you're going to go on to be a chemist later on, there's value in studying Shakespeare. There's value in understanding a broad liberal arts. I'm just wondering, the implications of your findings, do you think there's more value in taking a more British model where you begin at a younger age concentrating specifically on a subject that might be career focused, or is there more value in a liberal arts education, possibly linking to more creative frames of mind and multiple intelligences and other, lofty aspirational goals?
Thanks for the question. I'll try to be brief because I see there are other people. Oxbridge is interesting because it's not nearly as vocation-centric as most other European schools. And in fact, the Ivy schools were patterned after Oxbridge. I think the real question is something that, the real answer is something we touched on, that there are some societies where they begin to track much earlier.
Yes.
And I alluded to some independent schools here which do some of that work. But certainly if you randomly chose 1,000 people and send them to Amherst from the United States, most of them, I would say, shouldn't have too focused a profession. They should get what other people may have gotten at Andover or at one of the public schools, which are private schools in Britain. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, that's the thing about looking internationally, right? I'm thinking of the German system, which I know best of others, and that is they track students at very young ages, and therefore the students at university are already a narrower subset than they would be in the United States. So when you're thinking about how they can be more focused, you have to ask yourself which system from the ground up you prefer. Over here.
Hi, thank you so much. And I'm also trying not to fangirl right now. My question is, Ms. Wendy, you mentioned data regarding students looking at transformational versus transactional aspect of education, and I'm curious about the data that you have with respect to the socioeconomic backgrounds of these students, and if there's a trend that you've drawn from that to understand where the larger percentage of students lie who's looking for transformation versus transactional. And alongside that, I also wonder if universities and higher education institutions want to center learning, if there's a core challenge and anxiety around future readiness and jobs, then is there a, maybe not holding higher eds accountable, but responsible in also supporting students with that in their future line? And I think that comes from me as being a first-generation student as well, who would have been in that situation where I'm looking for transactional versus now transformational, now where I'm in a better state. So just thoughts on that.
Okay, yeah, so thank you for your question. So we did not systematically collect data about SES, and if we had, we actually wouldn't have reported it. And it can be a controversial issue. I'll start, but Howard, if you want to pipe in. First of all, with the 1,000 students that we interviewed, we felt we wouldn't have the numbers to do that kind of analysis if we had collected the information to make the statistics that we found significant one way or the other. The second reason why we didn't do it is because we were interviewing people and really wanted to develop a natural rapport with them. Since we were sitting in the room with them for an hour, we didn't want them to feel at all like they were put on the spot or interviewed for any particular reason. And the reason why we wouldn't report the data if we had collected it is just because we feel like it could be misused or misinterpreted. I know Howard has had experiences with that in his multiple intelligences data or findings that can easily get misused. And we didn't want to actually define people by a demographic if they didn't bring it up in conversation with us for an hour. So, if that was important to them or it caused challenge for them, we would have assumed that they would have raised it. So for that reason, we don't have the data you want, but the kind of data that we do have when we look at the majors students have, the high schools that students went to, and whether they were private or independent schools and where they grew up, we found very few differences. And so, but we don't have the systematic data across SES. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Thank you. Over here. Yes.
Hey, thank you so much for your really enlightening discussion. My question is about how to apply what you shared. So being a teaching fellow here in the yard, I have sections every week and I meet students and they all want to get A's, and that's all they come to sections for and classes for. So how can I, as a teaching fellow, really have them develop the heart for learning rather than going after grades and wanting to get a good job? So like just on the front lines, what can I do? because I can't really change the mission statement of the school or things like that. So how can I, at the front lines, bring that change?
Yeah. I can start. You can finish, because I'm sure you'll have, and Biddy, if you have a response, you're welcome to contribute. So actually, I don't have a magic answer. If I did, I think I'd win a prize, and every school would do what I suggested. But I do think stopping, and maybe for a class or a period of time, having students talk about what they think the purpose of college is about, why they're there, what they want to get out of it, what kind of experiences they have, what they plan to do with it, and when they talk about job, to follow up with those important questions. What if that job disappears? How does artificial intelligence or ChatGPT influence the kind of work you want to go into? What if that line of work doesn't exist? So those conversations, again, students were never asked those kinds of questions when they were in high school, nor they signed up for the interviews because they didn't really have the opportunity to talk to adults in college either. So it's not an easy response, but I do think the students that we're working with now, which has been probably about 250 students across 6 different schools or so, when we ask them these questions, it does stop a moment in time, and sometimes students can sort of realize and rethink. I'm not suggesting that they immediately will change, but just even getting some of those questions, I think, into their mind will help them rethink their approach and why they're maybe so worried or have so much angst.
Yeah, I think the stakes are very high for the reasons you stated. And I think in the first class, you need to begin with who you are and why you're doing what you're doing and why you think it's important, and finding out why they're there and what they want to get out of it and why they're in college and so on. And a lot really depends on whether they identify with you. And of course, that could be on anything from demography to that you mentioned something that they loved, or it's a good, that they like meeting at the time and the place where you're meeting, and you have to build on that. I mean, I was kind of a naughty professor here at the school for many years, and I would begin shopping by saying, if you study this course with me, it's totally useless. Now, of course, I didn't think it was totally useless, but I was trying to get them to think about, why do you read the kinds of things that we read? Why do you talk about the kinds of things that we talk? Why do you do the kind of projects? There's no question that there's going to be a certain percentage who don't even need that. They probably don't even need to go to college. They should go to Bard, where they look for those kinds of people. There are other people where it's hopeless. They just want to do tiddlywinks, or they may just want to be president of the class or be on the Crimson. But you want to work with those students where they may not have thought about these basic issues. And the more this is a common understanding among faculty, and it's much easier at Amherst than it is at the University of North Carolina, the more you really feel, well, this really is what school is about. And I would love the index, whether it comes from our work or somebody else, which really moves the envelope for the school as a whole to less of a transactional place, kind of a Black Mountain, if you know that school, where people really feel things are different. That's why we're interested in places like Minerva and London Interdisciplinary, or the Asian Women's School, where they've put their they put their chess piece on a square where it could be very powerful.
Thank you so much.
The only thing I would say is, it's not a direct response exactly. What I'm sitting here thinking, and I have the benefit of having been at Cornell for my scholarly career, and at the University of Wisconsin, which is a really strong academic institution, little known in the world apparently, but not the university, its football team, but how academically strong it is. And then Amherst, which is a very intellectual place. I've had the benefit of being there, so maybe this is useless, but I do think it's important to try and meet the students where they are. And as Howard and Wendy have found, to some degree that is in a state of anxiety about what's expected of them, what they need to do in order just to be able to make a living or do as well even as their parents might have done, or live up to their parents' expectations. And therefore, I think the kind of question that Wendy suggests, or even what makes you think that only A's will yield for you wonderful options after you graduate from a Harvard? You know, what? Because that isn't the case. I don't know. I think, especially given the mental health issues, trying to meet the students where they are is really important. At Amherst, you know, if you ask students what helps them the most, many of them will say the faculty. The faculty who are great teachers who care about how they're doing. And that might not be true everywhere, but I have to believe that's true for a lot of students at Harvard too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
To be honest, if I were the czar, I think I wouldn't have grading in college.
Yeah, yeah.
Because what's the point?
What's the point? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Daniela Garcia Estrella. I wanted to add on to Sabna's question because I do think understanding whether a student is first-gen, low income, has additional family responsibilities really would have shaped their experience and whether they have a transactional view of education or transformational, which would have also then maybe impacted the major that they selected given the career outcomes, and again, having to either provide for their family or be able to be more independent. Now, if those questions weren't asked, I was wondering if you asked about maybe the kinds of community they came from, if they came from a more independent mindset or interdependent, and if they experienced any sort of culture shock. So yeah. So did you get at that at all? And then another question that could kind of sort of connect income is...
Hold that one, and let's go to this one. Because otherwise, those, I would forget the first one. Yeah,
so we did ask students the communities they came from, and we asked them about their high school experiences, and we did ask them about their transition to college. So we did ask about all those things. I would just say one important finding is that while we did find that half the students in our sample were transactional about the college experience, that did differ. There are some nuances which we described. I just very quickly described a bunch of findings at the beginning. But one is that if students are transactional, it was described differently at different schools. So at the higher selective schools, it was definitely described as a way to get a job, to go to Goldman Sachs, and that was going to be their life. And if they didn't get that, that would be an unsuccessful college experience. But the students at the less selective schools, those many of whom worked full-time in addition going to school, really saw college as a transactional experience to become transformational. So they wanted to get the degree to open up possibilities in their life, to change the course of their family's life. So that we call transactional to be transformational. Yeah. And we did find that when we found that particular code, when we coded for that, that was often the students, again, at the less selective schools.
That's really interesting.
And you know, that's an argument in a sense for not having a priori group people demographically, because this emerged from the conversation rather than, oh, well, you have another job, so you couldn't be transformational.
So then the other part of the question that I had was, you mentioned that you did have their location of where they're coming from. I don't know if you have something as specific as a zip code, and if that could be used as a proxy for income.
Yeah. So we did collect that information. I know Sophie is here. Painstakingly, we did some analysis on that, but we actually decided not to report it in the book because we didn't want to assume any kind of socioeconomic status by zip code, but we do have the information. And again, we find very few differences. But again, we didn't want to make assumptions about income, nor would we report it if we found it in case it was misinterpreted. We wanted to be very careful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, over here.
Hello. First, thank you for giving us all an opportunity to listen to you live here today. You mentioned Minerva and London interdisciplinary schools as these new higher education institutions with new missions, maybe new models, new philosophies. And I was curious to ask, for those of us, or overall, considering creating a good future for higher education, creating the best institutions possible, what are your takes on creating new institutions versus trying to reform ones that already exist? Thank you.
That's a Howard question.
Which he means that that's a bullshit question. I mean, it's interesting. There are probably 200 people in the world who could endow something with more money than Harvard.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, what's the endowment, 55 billion?
You're looking at me?
Yeah.
I think that's right, 50-some billion, yeah.
I don't think there's a right answer to that question. I would certainly want to start with trying to take a school that's already trying to do this and help them do it better. People talk about Arizona State, they talk about Southern New Hampshire, they talked about Bard, but I do think that if, in many countries now, there are wealthy people who start schools, or you work with people in Spain, and I don't think it's an either-or kind of question. I think it's much more if you have a sense of integrity and you make it clear what you're trying to achieve. You have to be a learning institution, realize what you make mistakes. I mean, I made a crack about University of Austin because they announced themselves with a big to do, but then when you picked away, it didn't seem to be that good. But if they learn from it, that's fine. Yeah, it's really being a learning institution.
Yeah. By the way, Harvard is not the wealthiest school.
Texas?
No, it's per student.
Princeton.
Princeton, if you look at the endowment per student, Harvard teaches many more students than a Princeton. So I think often people say about Harvard, it's the wealthiest, but it's not quite
spoken like
true.
a member of the corporation, which you are.
Oh, well, that's irrelevant. Okay, thank you for that. Yes, over here.
It was especially interesting to hear what you had to say, given that today is decision day for many people who are starting universities, so thank you. I was really interested to hear about how transformative informal education experiences were, or off-site experiences were for some of those students, and I'm curious in thinking about how to translate your findings for parents and for middle schools or upper schools. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about gap years and also the experiences of some students who are admitted to the more rigorous programs by virtue of their starting in the spring term. Often they're very committed to that school, and so they're prepared to do something in the fall semester. And I'm curious because so often gap years or that sort of admit is considered an afterthought, and yet perhaps developmentally that's a moment of resonance and true development toward the transformative experience that we really want young adults to have.
Well, I think a lot of faculty and administrators would agree with you about the gap year. So one of the questions we asked was, if you were the czar of a college or higher education, what changes would you want to make? What are up to 3 changes? We didn't get very many substantive kinds of responses to that question, especially from students, some who said, we'll change the size of my dresser drawers. But from faculty and administrators, we did hear a lot from them about a gap year and saying how that would actually be very beneficial for students. So they would agree with you. And I think because of COVID and the pandemic, where a lot of students did take gap years, hopefully people will see that as being a much more worthwhile way to spend time. So yeah, I agree. I don't know that I have anything more to say about that particular.
Thank you. We're being told we can take one more question, so that will be you.
Lucky me.
Yeah.
Thank you all again for being here. Appreciate your time and your insight. And if you disagree with the premise of this question, let me know, and that's totally fine as well. I saw a narrative playing out, Wendy, as you walked us through your research, a narrative about higher education in America right now. Let's say the ideas that you all suggested aren't implemented. Where does this narrative go? What patterns that you all identified in your work continue? What withers away? Put succinctly, if these ideas aren't implemented, this train we're all on, where is it headed?
I think that's a great question. Maybe we should all respond to that, because that might be a nice way to end. Although my story might be a little depressing. When we started our study in 2012, a portion of our country was really thinking about whether college was worth it in terms of the return on investment, ROI. And now half the country really believes that it's damaging for students. In many ways, higher education capital is a hopeful concept, because what I didn't say when I explained it is that on the whole, we find that for college students, higher education capital increases over the course. When we compare first-year students to graduating students, we find that higher education capital increases. That's not at every institution, but it is across the broad base of students. And we also find that when we look at higher education capital at our young alums, there's similar scores to those of our graduating students, which is good news, bad news. The good news is that it doesn't decrease. The bad news is it doesn't increase after college either, or at least from the first job. So it really does point to the value of what college is, this unique opportunity for intellectual growth and a focus on the development of the mind, which we can prove with the higher ed measure that it actually does work. But I think the work is to reshape it and to re-energize it and to hopefully create this conversation where people are talking about these important issues. You might not agree with everything, but at least we're talking about them and reconsidering what our schools need to be. So that's my response.
This was almost like a Rorschach inkblot that you gave me. And of course, that reveals people's personalities as much as it does their analytic skills. But I'm going to make 3 points very quickly. Number one, on this journal we're putting out about higher education around the world, we're working with Bill Kirby, who's a professor of Chinese history here. He says the 19th century was Germany.
Yeah.
20th century was the United States. 21st century is likely to be China, unless dramatic things happen. And China is busy at work all around the world while we're playing football on Saturday. Just kidding.
I'm not.
Wendy and I are very focused on the I aspect of this country, capital I, and what it takes to move toward we. And almost all the work we're doing on now is because we think that there's terrible egocentrism. You have your slide of, well, that's for nothing, slide of some mother in kindergarten saying to her child, well, you better take advantage of first grade and do all the networking you need. But the third thing, and this didn't come up except I think very incidentally, I think ChatGPT is going to completely shake up what we do in our schools. And maybe it'll be for the good. But it's up to you folks, particularly those of you who are studying education, to figure out what it is that artificial intelligence can do much better than us, and what are the things that only human beings or their successors, whatever they are, can do. Biddy, I'm happy to give you the last word.
That's a bad idea. I like what you all said. I think looking internationally is really crucial, and I certainly agree that since the medieval period through the 19th century, Germany certainly reigned, if you think about what got emulated. It's not that it was necessarily the best, but what got emulated in this country. And maybe, yes, the 20th century, at least post-World War II period in this country, it's the United States. I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't know. But I do think, to go back to my point about college being more than just the training of the mind, which I know you all also believe, because you wouldn't put the emphasis you're putting on the we if you didn't believe that college is also about learning to think with others, learning to live with others, learning how to take different points of view and how to live with the difference. And that is one of the major contributions, in my view, potentially, of college. It can be intertwined with the academic and is in some places increasingly. But I think what a lot of college-aged young people want is company. They want a sense of community. They're lonely. They are pressured to death to excel at all costs. They're worried about the direction in which the climate is going, the country is going. I don't know really how to think about what it would be like to be in college right now. Well, I'm too old, although it wasn't so easy when I was there either. I guess all I'm saying is that I think the work that Howard and Wendy have done is really crucially important, and that the fact that they are able to make concrete recommendations, I hope, will yield fruit and help. I do think the intellectual mission of colleges and universities needs to be front and center. And I also think that colleges and universities and the experience for young people entails much more than just the intellectual. It always has. As long as it continues, it will. But that the drift that you all point out is a real problem that needs to be addressed. I hope that it survives. A lot of colleges are going under, but if the values in the society as a whole continue to be focused on the few things that define success these days, focused on wealth and power, as the society seems to be, at least parts of it, as long as that's going on, expecting colleges and universities to be able successfully to inculcate a different set of values without being accused of being woke is going to be a very difficult task. Nonetheless, you all are up to helping us do that. And isn't this amazing that they would take on something so massive and so crucial and do it in the way that only they could do? So let's thank Howard and Wendy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Biddy.
Thank you. That was fun.